analysis of colonized relations stresses their interdependence and the mutual construction of their subjectivities. Baba makes one particular contention that all cultural statements and systems are constructed in a space which he calls the third space of enunciation. Cultural identity always emerges in this ambivalent space, as Baba points out. This ambivalent space for Baba makes it untenable to claim hierarchical purity of cultures. This is the most vehement attack on Eurocentrism. In this in-between space that carries the meaning of culture, it is this in-between space that carries the meaning of culture, and this is what makes the notion of hybridity important. Hybridization takes many forms, including cultural, political, and linguistic forms. This notion of hybridity is central to Homi Bhabha's work. He challenges notions of identity, culture, and nation as coherent and unified, and that they exhibit a linear historical development. In his article entitled Cultural Diversity and Cultural Difference, Bhabha stresses the interdependence of colonizer and colonized. He maintains that members of a post-colonial society have an identity which has been shaped jointly by their unique cultural and community history, but intertwined with that of the colonial power. And therefore he writes, I quote, "These hyphenated, hybridized cultural conditions are also forms of a vernacular cosmopolitanism that emerges in multicultural societies and explicitly exceeds a particular national location," unquote. The themes of hybridity and multi-rootedness are in part expressions of the subjective experience of globalization as well. As one critic said, we must brace up to the idea of convergence in the post-colonial, postmodernist context, the convergence of the canonical and the marginal, the written and oral forms of cultural expression. Gramsci, the theorist of cultural hegemony, argued that the ruling classes achieve domination not by force or coercion alone, but by creating subjects who are willingly prepared to be submitted to. That is, his concept of hegemony distinguishes between literal political dominance and dominance through ideas and culture. Many critics call this colonization of culture. During colonization, the indigenous cultures of those countries subjected to foreign rule were often sidelined and suppressed. They were openly in favor of elevating the social and cultural preferences and conventions of the colonizers. As a reaction,
Kausalya Barracks, mute your mic. Mute your mic.
Most post-colonial literature seeks to assert the richness, diversity, and validity of indigenous cultures. They seek to restore pride in the cultural practices and traditions that were systematically degraded under colonialism. This is where we notice the significance of Achebe's focus upon Igbo culture and orality. Thus, post-colonialism addresses the question of revisiting history. Colonizers often depicted their colonial subjects as existing outside of history in changing, timeless societies. Colonizers depicted colonial subjects as people who were unable to progress or develop, people who were unable to progress or develop without their intervention or assistance. In this way, they justified their actions, including violence against those who resisted colonial rule. Story from the perspective of those colonized is thus a major preoccupation of post-colonial writing. Literal colonization is not the exclusive of colonial study. Let us remember, in a literary context, Fanon's work has been used as a means of conceptualizing the construction of identity. Fanon's work paved the way for configuring the relationship between literary representations and the construction of national consciousness. Although many colonized countries are home to multiple indigenous languages, most colonial writers choose write in the colonizer's tongue. The language question is another question to be taken into account. Other tongue versus the other tongue. In Bharatipura, U.R. Anantamurthy writes about the dilemma of those Indians who knew only English. I may have a rent. I may have to rent a house in Bangalore. A radical throwing parties, but still my Indianness is linked only to Ravi Shankar Sitar, the sculptures of Konark and folk songs, he says. He said in one of his lectures that the best thing to do as a creative writer is to be rooted in your language but branch out into the world. This is what is best illustrated by A.K. Ramanujan. We also remember, what about post-linkages? Devi, G. and Devi asked this question. Gayatri Spivak yoking together of English literature to the teaching of literary and cultural production in English and the vernacular languages. Some writers, for example, have observed that since the language point of view of, we have authors such as Arundhati Roy who deliberately play remolding it to reflect the rhythms and syntax of indigenous languages. They invent new styles and demonstrate mastery of a language that was, in a sense, forced upon them. They have also reworked colonial European art forms to reflect indigenous modes of invention and creation. Now I come to the issue of nation. Every nation, state, or individual in the post-colonial context is an amalgamation of history and tradition. And in the post-colonial context, it is by understanding the idea of cultural hybridity that we tend to explore the concept of nation. The ambiguous and shifting nature of national identity has been drawn attention to by Homi Bhabha. The British created the prototypical Western nation state, and both face at least certain challenges. First, they must face the challenge of globalization of culture. Globalization of culture is not merely in terms of the proliferation and mobility of texts and audiences. Globalization of culture tends to express a movement of culture outside the spaces of any nation and language. In fact, as Giddens points out, globalization is the reason for the revival of cultural identities, local cultural identities in different parts of the world. So much so that a critic can no longer confidently assume that he or she understands even within their own limited territories. I have come to the end of my lecture. I would draw attention to a particular lecture delivered by Arundhati Roy. Arundhati Roy is a W.G. Sibbald lecture on literary translation delivered at the British Library on January 5th, 2018. Globalization, the language issue, and various other factors, the genus-based identity of nation and language, and so on and so forth that I have spoken about. The lecture is entitled, "What is the morally appropriate language in which to think and write?" Let us remember that this lecture was a response to Susan Sontag's Sibbald lecture in 2002, which was entitled "The World as India, Translation as a Passport Within the Community of Literature." Here, Arundhati Roy is speaking about her Ministry of Utmost Happiness. She says about this novel that it is written in English but imagined in several languages. She says that it's a story that emerges out of an ocean of languages which have no choice but to coexist and to survive. The Ministry of Happiness has been, Arundhati Roy says, translated into many languages. And she further says that each of these translators had to grapple with a language that is infused of Englishes, the sociolects of the English language. That is what the post-colonial cultural scene is. Thank you very much. I thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Fakir Mohan University and the convener of the webinar, Dr. Sonali Das, for giving me this opportunity to make a presentation on post-colonialism, post-colonial theory, approaches and implications. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I now request Professor Nagaraju to make his remarks.
Dr. Das, I'm audible?
Yeah, you are.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Vishweshwar Rao. I think that's a very detailed, typical keynote address. Some of the current vocabulary that is used in the post-colonial criticism has been highlighted. You have alterity, hybridity, otherness, marginality, and Eurocentrism. Apart from discussion on some of the writers, I think one of the important aspects of Professor Rao's talk is how post-colonialism focuses on rewriting history and the Janus phase of nationalism. Apart from, other explication of other terms like hybridity and alterity, quoting Mikhail Bakhtin. This is, I think, rewriting history or sifting history, writing history from the post-colonial perspective has been a topic which I think, critics like Gayatri Spivak, even Romila Thapa talks very clearly about. Nation, I think, Professor Rao has, highlighted some of the issues involved in the debate about nation. I think he talks about how nation is Janus-based and conceptually ambiguous. We have the debates about nation right from Tagore and Gandhi. Tagore calls nationalism apadevata, and Partha Chatterjee produces a critique of nation and the fragments that the kind of nation we have imagined for ourselves. Ashish Nandi talks about the illegitimacy of nationalism. So nationalism in post-colonial criticism is a much debated concept, and Professor Rao is right in saying about the ambiguity around it. So, overall, I think the talk is very, very informative and elaborate, and it should form the basis for the papers to be read in the subsequent sessions. I think the organizers owe you thanks to Professor Rao for his elaborate address. But from my personal side, thank you, Professor Rao. Sir, I think it's wonderful listening to you, wonderful to be connected back to you after a long time. My regards to you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Nagaraju.
I would like to request Dr. Soumya Sangeeta Sahu, Assistant Professor of English, to propose a vote of thanks for both the sessions. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Department of Language and Literature, Fakir Mohan University, I would like to propose vote of thanks to the chairs and the speakers of the inaugural session and the keynote address. I would like to thank Professor N. Nagaraju, Sir, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Gangadhar Meher University, and Chair for the and Speaker for the inaugural session. His paper on post-colonial and the tribe, category of the tribe, he covered many areas and gave us many thought-provoking ideas as to how the anti-colonial resistance movement initiated by the tribals throughout the country led to the nation building, how the tribes and the suppression of the tribes form a major idea in the post-colonial temperament throughout the country. His unusual reading of the anti-colonial temperament present within the tribal literature and their laws form a basis of the nation building in the post-colonial era in India. Thank you, sir, for your elaborate and thought-provoking lecture. I thank Professor Santosh Kumar Tripathi, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Fakir Mohan University, for his gracious presence and chairing the session. Now I would like to thank Professor C.R.V. Rao, sir, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Vikram Simhapuri University, Nellore, for his lecture titled Post-Colonialism, Approaches and Implications. I would like to thank you, sir, for your elaborate paper covering many areas of post-colonialism. He started his lecture by introducing the term post-colonialism in its various dimensions. Then he reflected on the approaches and the implications present within it. He reflected and gave many definitions regarding the major post-colonial concepts such as subalternism, Eurocentrism, the binary between self and others. He also gave remarks on the post-colonial trinity, Syed, Bhabha, Spivak, and also brought out the ideas put forward by M. Cized, Bill Ashcroft, Hachian, Appadurai, and major new post-colonial complex and multifaceted phenomena, which is also historical, political, and has many implications. Thank you, sir, for your elaborate lecture. And I would also like to thank Professor N. Nagaraju for chairing the session and his gracious presence. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We have come to the end of the inaugural session. Now we begin our first paper reading session. I would like to request Professor Ashok Kumar Mahanti to chair this session. Professor Ashok Kumar Mahanti, sir?
Yes, I am.
Yes, I would like to, before we begin the paper reading session, let me introduce Professor Ashok Kumar Mahanti to the august gathering. Professor Ashok Kumar Mahanti is a specialist in ELT, having done his course and training at SIFL, Hyderabad, which is renamed as FLU. He was also a research fellow at IIT Kanpur, having taught at different colleges such as Bhadrak College, NC College, and BJP College. He headed the PG Department of English, Revenue College, Cuttack for 4 years. He has earned a name for himself as a good reviewer. His latest book of Vijay Kumar Das, Ashish Nandi's Exiled at Home, Theory and Praxis, appeared in the Literary Criterion in April 2021. Apart from this, he published a number of research papers in different Indian journals of India. He is the chief editor of the book Biocritic of Vijay Kumar Das, which was published in 2017. Currently, he is a professor of English Social Sciences at Soha University, Bhubaneswar. I welcome you, sir, to today's webinar. I would like to request you to chair this session, and the paper readers are Dr. Dolan Roy, Dr. Rima Ghosh, and Mr. Brajakishore Pal. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sonali.
Yes, sir.
It's a great privilege to chair the paper reading session. Prior to it, I felt at one point of time little out of breath when I very attentively listened to Professor Rao, Professor Saat's encyclopedic sketch of the entire PC. He holds the key to the he submitted before this August audience. And then prior to Professor Nagaraju's the tribal text and the post-colonial implications and all that. Prior to it, the first Vice Chancellor, Professor S.K. Tripathi, and the chairperson of the Postgraduate Council, Professor Adhikari, these are all luminaries in their own rights. So this is my paper reading session. I have the privilege of collecting three very eminent presenters with whom I have earlier acquaintances. They are Dr. Dolan Roy, Dr. Rima Ghosh, and Mr. Brajakishore Pal. So they'll be dealing with really the praxis side of it, the aspects of how the PC theories and post-colonial theories very effective in naming or nicknaming whatever you call PC theories and TM theory, postmodern theory. So Dr. Dolan Roy, let me inform you a little bit, just half a second I will take. Mrs. Teshlimar Ao was of my batchmate in 1974 in April, then Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages. So her one or two writings I have read it, but not more. But I guess you will throw light on the identity politics of Mrs. Howe. We then used to call her very familiarly, and she's a favorite of our participants' friends then. So now I would request, not taking much of my time, about Dolan Roy, the politics of identity in Peninsula Howe short story. Please.
A very good afternoon. My respect to the chairs and the other dignitaries present there, and my best wishes to all my dear colleagues present in this conference. I am Dr. Dolan Ray, Assistant Professor in English at Chatna Chandidash Mahavidyalaya, affiliated to Bankura University of West Bengal. I am here, and I am also the I have done my research under Dr. Vijay Kumar Das, who is my guru, and I am indebted to him for for connecting me to this seminar, so that I am getting this opportunity to present before you this paper. Before I begin my paper as present, I will talk about the first part of my paper title, The Politics of Identity. Now, as we have seen, the post-colonialism is actually an umbrella term. If we refer to Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin, they have related to, they have actually used the term post-colonial to refer to all the cultures who had been affected by imperialism. And therefore, this under the ambit of post-colonial literature comes all the literatures from taking from the Latin America to the South Asian literature, of which Indian English literature is also a very major part, to the Southeast Asian cultures, as well as literature from from the island nations of Oceania, that is Australia, New Zealand, everything. So post-colonial literatures or post-colonialism as a term, it covers, and while we are dealing with post-colonialism, in post-colonialism we are often rereading, or we are often seeing treatment or applications or portrayal of some cultures, something which has not been yet done in the traditional or the canonical English literature. So now I will come to Temsula Au. Temsula Au uh, is primarily an eminent poet, and who was also professionally and a professor of English, teaching at the Northeastern Hill University situated at Shillong. She has retired. She has many volumes of poetry to her credit, as well as she won a Sahitya Academy Award for this particular short story, her short story collection, Laburnum for My Head. So now in this particular paper, I will first of all deal with what do I mean by the politics of identity, and then I will, by referring to some of the stories, I will show that how uh, Temsula Au presents this identity politics at the heart of her stories. Identity, if I take recourse to Amartya Sen's book Identity and Violence, is actually a protean term. It is an ever changing, and it is not only a protean term, it is also a very dynamic term. And identity is never fixed. Identity actually depends upon the choice. Choice of what? Choice of prioritizing the affiliations to which every person belongs. A person can have familial affiliations, will also be having certain political affiliations, will also be having some cultural, uh, some professional. So he will be having a number of affiliations, and the identity of the person at a particular moment and a particular place of time depends upon to which affiliation he is giving the utmost priority. So a person who is a friend, who is also a friend to another person, suddenly becomes an Hindu or a Muslim aggressor whenever he thinks that his religious identity is threatened by the aggression of some people. That people might be his friend also, but why he feels at that moment threatened, because at that moment of crisis, to him his religious identity gets the utmost priority. So what is the uniqueness of these stories in Temsula House? In Temsula House, the stories, though the stories are rooted in the backdrop of her own ethnic background, that is, she belongs to Nagaland. So these stories, more or less, are actually present in actually the local is in Nagaland, or in the hilly areas of the northeastern states. But when we go through the stories, we will find that these stories have a very good connection. In a way, she ultimately prioritizes the basic identity of the individual, that is the humanity, and how that humanity is actually gaining his or her identity, or gaining his or her place in this world by interacting with nothing else but with nature. So the titular story, that is Laburnum for My Head, is actually a story of Lentina, who in a way does not love, who being a Christian, uh, has been planning for long for her burial site. And so, what she does, belonging to a rich family of the town, she decides to buy a place where, besides the graveyard, which, because it is adjacent to the graveyard, was not such a popular site for property dealers. So she buys that spot, and there she plants certain laburnum saplings, so that she can, once they are in bloom, so she can die in peace, so that the blooming laburnum, that is the yellow laburnums, will actually be the sort of memorial, because other memorials, he knows they will be defaced, but she knows that these laburnum plants, even if they dies, they will be leaving behind other saplings, other plants, which will again grow up and will be, in a way, will be remembering her. So in a way, so she takes into propagate her memory forever. She is not, she does not want her memory to propagate it in in the minds of the people through the epitaphs or tombstones, nothing like that. But she wants herself to be uh, immortalized by uh, by interred in a place where nature had its full sway. So in a way, in this story, the central character, Lentina, is actually rooting her identity as a primal person who who has a connection, who feels a very innate, intrinsic connection to the natural surroundings. And so, in order to perpetuate her memory, she takes help not of the traditional means, the traditional memorial, the means of memorials, that is, poems being published, obituaries, nothing like that, but simple blooms of the laburnum trees, the simple yellow, bright blooms of the laburnum trees. In the second story, the story is titled The Death of a Hunter. Hmm. So, in the story, The Death of a Hunter, at first, when we hear to the story, we feel as if it is as if we will be going to read an adventure story of a tribal huntsman who has died while going on a hunting expedition. No, it is not like that. It is simply, the story talks about how the identity of oneself changes when we when our priorities in life, when our vocations in life changes. So Death of a Hunter actually talks about the story of a man, and the story of a person who took great pride in his fame as a hunter, who was called by the forest officials, the government forest officials, to the deal with the menace of marauding animals. So what happens? A kind of a supernatural experience, which was a mystery. The mystery is not solved, but in a way, he understands that the hunting down of an animal, though it may be, it is though he was doing for the benefit of his own neighbors, but ultimately it was an act of killing. So at the end of the story, we find the hunter, that is Imchanok, uh, bearing down his tools of hunting, that is great gun and all, and taking up the life of a simple cultivator farmer. So in this story, the experience that he undergoes actually makes him uh, think about his identity, his role in this world, and he decides that he will no longer prioritize. He will no longer present himself as a hunter who had a reputation not only in his local village but all around in the entire surrounding areas, which is a huge area. He decides that he will honor that intrinsic connection that humanity shares with Mother Nature. And so, from that time onwards, he he buries, as if he gives a burial to his self of hunting, and and he takes a rebirth, as if he, like a phoenix, he rises up not as a hunter anymore, but as a simple human being who will, from now onwards, who will be honoring the flora and the fauna of the surrounding areas. As time is short, I will now sum up my ideas. So, in these stories, the people, though they are very different, their cultural backdrop, their education, everything is different. But what I want to focus is in this case is that in post-colonialism, actually, we all know that the English education, it was actually this English education, the system of education was first brought into vogue by Macaulay, who intended to make a group of people who will be British in habit, but who will not be the Britishers, who will be British in habit, but who will be able to act as a bridge between the natives and the who will act as their agents, but will not have the power. But as uh, as it happened in the Tempest, the this colonized nations, the world, the nations who bore the brunt of imperialism, they took forth this education and the language that they learned from their colonizers, and they turned back on them to talk about their own people. And in Temsula, our stories, we find that this she is not doing with any kind of a very assertive politicization. I have just referred to two stories, but I will say that in the entire collection of the stories, we will find that it talks about the insurgencies that happens there. There she is also talking about stories how uh, generations on women are actually interconnected, as it is related in the story, the three women. The in the letter we find how this people, uh, that is there are three factions, that is the government people, the insurgents, and the commoners. But how, though there are three distinct factions, but how particularly the letter proves that ultimately every person has an identity which is not a political identity, not a religious identity, not a cultural identity, but above all, in that particular story, the letter, the human identity, that is that humanity that we share with everyone, with every individual, is to be prioritized. She, without talking, without
So
any.
would it be inconvenient to for your presentation, because there are 7 more papers to be read? Sorry
Okay,
to
I am
interrupt.
I am summing up. I am at the end of my presentation. Okay, so let me sum up. There's only 2 lines. So through all these stories, Temsula Au actually presents a group of people where she is actually prioritizing by not talking about any political insurgencies or anything like that. She prioritizes the innate humanity, and this is her politics of identity. So in this way, he talks back to the colonial discourse where the politicized or the religious identities were often focused upon.
Thank you,
Hmm.
Roland.
So,
Yes, we'll go to the next presenter, Dr. Rima Ghosh.
Yes,
Our
Namaskar.
topic is Namaskar, Post-Colonial Sense in the Nonsense Literature of Sukumar Rai. Would I advise Rima to confine yourself to maximum 10 to 12 minutes time?
Yes, sir. Namaskar, my name is Dr. Rima Ghosh. I'm an assistant professor of English. My college is Shami Nisham Bolanando Girls College, affiliated to Calcutta University. At the outset, I convey my regards to the Honorable Chair of the session and best wishes to the co-paper presenters. I express my heartfelt regards and gratitude to the Chair of the VC and the whole organizing committee of the seminar, along with the luminaries of academics of the country present in the seminar. I'm grateful to my research supervisor, Professor B.K. Das, for inspiring me to attend this seminar. I start my paper by saying that despite being famously known as a Bengali children's writer, Sukumar Ray's writing are a famous source of a critical understanding of contemporary society, particularly the colonial Bengal and India. The underestimation of the children's literature allowed him to pick holes in the British colonial rule very safely. In Music or Poetry, T.S. Eliot argued that the nonsense literature problematizes the world's affairs as it can see the undercurrent beneath the skin. In Sukumar Ray, we see on one hand, the search for identity in both the colonizer and the colonized, and on the other hand, there is the emergence of the third space and also the subaltern voice. The present paper investigates how various pieces of nonsense writing of Sukumar Ray define both the identities of the colonizer and the colonized in the post colonial context. At the very beginning, we investigate the identity crisis in the object and subject of the colonization. In poems like Stew Much, Kim Bhuth, Missing Whiskers, The Kids of Ramgorur, etc., we find such examples. Shivaji Bandyopadhyay points out how the application of the key degree theory in such poems hints at the destabilizing power in Sukumar Ray's work to expose the assimilative myth that binds Bhadralok society. This also reflects the counter post-colonial discourse behind this text. Based on the psychoanalysis of Laka and post-structuralism, Bhabha's theorization of mimicry, ambivalence, and hybridity project the paradoxical position of the colonizer. There is a constant effort of the colonizer to differentiate himself from the colonized and at the same time to eradicate the differences in between. This creates a third space in between. The contradictory fetish phobia sentiments create the two stereotypes in the colonizer for the native. One is the unknowable other, and the other is the controllable, knowable, childlike, innocent colonized subject. Bhabha's essay Science Taken for Wonders the English book investigate that if translated by the native, an authoritative text of the colonizer can be transformed into a medium of resistance against the authority of the colonizer. Bhabha extends this discussion and proposes the theory of mimicry through Western education, religion, philosophy, cultural intakes. The white man systematically disciplines the native colonized, teaches him to ape the white man. Nevertheless, once the newly westernized ape starts adopting the English culture, it learns the English language, reason, logic, questions the British structure and disrupts the colonial monolithic authority. In Stew Much, Sukumar Ray first projects a mutual quest of the colonizer and the colonized, nurtured for the other. The non comprehensive and forced metamorphosis proves futile for both the parties. In Kimbooth, this desire is not mutual. The original creature behind Kimbooth can be the colonizer or the colonized, whatever it is, it remains unidentified. However, when it is turned into someone it wanted to become for long, it falls into the pit of severe identity crisis. The alienation from the body self endangers the identity of the new creatures because they still have their old memory, practice, beliefs, desires, all of which are crudely barred because of the lack of body restrictions of the new khichdi or ki degree. This contradiction vividly signifies the contradictory nature of the two different civilizations, also in as reflected in the binary of East and the West. Both the creatures are fraught with the loss of identity and its subsequent trauma. Any superficial amalgamation proves to be very much futile. This disconnection between the new physical self and the old psychological tendencies proves that to be very much true. To employ Aristotle's idea of laughter in Nicomachean ethics, to stew much or both, we see the humor brought against this odd mixture is an insult against both the components of the creatures, that is, the colonizer and the colonized. We can also connect Barks or Hare. The machine of their bodies are misplaced. Therefore, in stew much, work plans of the newly generated creatures induce colossal laughter. The first cause of the laughter is the unexpected behavioral patterns in those creatures, and the second is their endeavor to use their body machine according to their past practices. Now everything we see, every time we see in Ray that he remains inconclusive, hinting at the ongoing process of this act, which also challenges the comfort zone of the reader. Subhadra Sengupta in Sukumar Ray, a legacy of laughter, argues that Ray disobeys the British civil codes and conducts, indicating a kind of Swadeshi resistance. She equates both nonsense and Swadeshi with each other, saying that both of them offer a possibility of an alternative reality and throws resistance to the authority as well. Post partition Bengal witnessed formidable resistance from the writing of the native journals, creating paranoia in the British rule. Hence, to resist their power, the power of the Press Act was passed in 1910. In such a critical juncture, Sukumar Ray, who lived in the in the beginning of the 20th century, Sukumar Ray devised his own way of expression and outmaneuvered censorship and avoided the charge of sedition. Now, Ray wanted the nonsense to be accepted as a serious art form in India. In that sense, the addition of Khayal Rasa is a credit earned by Sukumar Ray himself as a promoter of the indigenous tradition. This is his unique contribution to the traditional rasa system of the Indian aesthetics. With the abundant employment of puns, alliteration, onomatopoeia, under the supervision of wit, humor, Sukumar Ray blends the folk rhymes or Bengali chora tradition. Although inspired by Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll, Ray not a blind follower, but rather that like that of the mimic man. He learns the art of the master only to resist them. Besides, this rare assimilation is so unique that comprehensive and comprehensive that the young children cannot feel any foreignness in this new texts. In the King of Bombagor, Ray ridicules the eponymous character along with his
It is
family.
time, Rima.
Okay.
It is already a little bit over time.
Should I conclude?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
So
sure.
there are other examples where we find that various institutions of post-colonial agencies has been resisted by Sukumar Ray in the example of Dasu, Pagla Dasu or Ekushe Ain, Khuror Kol, that is the uncle's machine. So from the perspective of science education, I have tried to analyze those texts. And to conclude the paper, I would like to conclude it on 2 points. One is the Platonic Thumus, where we can understand that there is a desire of the to be recognized by both the colonizer and the colonized, that is being so much visible in this text. And the other is the consociational theory, where we find that this when we laugh together, there is a kind of unity among the inhabitants. So when we are looking at these characters and we laugh together through this consociational theory, we are being united, and that also create a kind of resistance to the authority. So on that note, I would like to end my paper. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And now we'll go to the first paper reading session. The third person is Project Kishore Pal. It will be talking about post-colonial reading of Nissim Ezekiel's poems. Jose Kishore Pal, please.
I think he got disconnected, sir.
That's why I'm not able to see neither his face nor his voice.
He has joined. He has joined, sir. Yeah, Mr. Brajakishore Pal, please present your paper. Please present your paper, sir.
Yes. Is there any problem? What is there?
Please present your paper, sir.
Is he muted or what?
No.
Brajakishore, please present your paper. Yes, you are there already. I see your face on the screen. Brajakishore Pal.
Please present the paper, sir. Yes. You are not audible, sir.
Something is wrong or what? Connection.
Mr. Brajakishore Pal, please present your paper.
Sonali.
Yes, yes. We will take Shilpi. Are you there, Shilpi? Yeah, please present your paper.
My fellow paper presenter.
Braja sir, you are not audible, sir. Braja sir. Okay, Shilpi, present your paper now. Braja sir will present later. Shilpi.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Am I
Two voices coalescing.
Should I present?
You know,
Sir,
Rajababu, please wait for the second paper reading session.
Shilpi,
Please, because his voice is not audible. Rajakishore, might be some connection problems or audio problem.
After Shilpi presents her paper, then Braja sir can present his paper.
Yes.
Yes, Shilpi, start.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon to all my respected teachers and all others presented in the webinar. I am Shilpi Boshak. I am from West Bengal and working as an assistant teacher in a higher secondary school. In 2021, I get the chance to pursue my PhD work in the FM University. I am highly grateful to Sonali Madam for giving me the chance to present my paper in this webinar. Thank you, ma'am. The title of my paper is Transmission of the Distortion of History from Colonialism to Post-Colonialism, a short critique of Kamaleshar's partitions. Quote unquote, the conscious and deliberate bleeding of India by England throughout 150 years is the greatest crime in all history. William Durant, The Case for India. The rich and affluent civilization of long 5,000 years, India is actually a land of syncretism and eclecticism, secularism and pluralism, civic nationalism and multiculturalism. This great fertile land produces saints like Buddha, human emperors like Ashok and Akbar, mystical poets like Kabir, Dadu, Amir Khusro, Mirabai, dramatists like Shudraka Kalidasa, economists like Kautilya, scientists and mathematicians like Aryabhatta, Barahamihir, Brahmagupta, and the great messengers of mankind like Tagore and Mother Teresa. The unique and gigantic temples of Ellora, Madura, and Angkor, the perfect artistry of Delhi, Agra, and the Taj Mahal are indeed the manifestations of sculpted lyrics in stone. The wonder that was India hosted down the age people of different countries, castes, and creeds to make herself an all men's land. This quote unquote glittering jewel of the medieval world, Shashi Tharoor, an era of darkness, quote unquote.